The heavy manila envelope slid across the polished mahogany of the desk. The sound it made was distinct, a dry, abrasive whisper against the flawless wood, sounding impossibly loud in the cavernous expanse of the Vance family study. I stared at it. The edges of the paper were sharp, perfectly straight, resting exactly 2 inches from the tips of my standard-issue black orthopedic work shoes. The envelope was thick. Unnaturally thick. I didn't need to see inside to know what filled it. The scent of old paper, leather-bound books, and the sharp, citrus tang of expensive furniture polish hung heavy in the air, but beneath all of that, I could almost smell the crisp ink of newly minted $100 bills. A fortune. A lifeline. A severance package wrapped in a very quiet, very deadly threat. I kept my gaze fixed on the envelope, forcing my breathing to remain shallow. Steady. If I breathed too deeply, the stiff white collar of my uniform would dig into my throat, a physical reminder of exactly what I was in this house: property. Replaceable. Insignificant. Take it, Maya. Eleanor Vance's voice was smooth, cultured, carrying the slight, unmistakable drawl of old Connecticut money. It was the kind of voice that never needed to raise its volume to command absolute obedience. She sat behind the massive desk, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling snow-covered grounds of the Long Island estate. The pale winter sunlight cast long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the dead air. She wasn't looking at me. She was examining her manicured nails, tracing the edge of her diamond ring with her thumb. It was a calculated dismissal. I was not a person to her, I was a minor inconvenience, a smudge on the immaculate glass of her family's legacy that needed to be wiped away before company arrived. My hands trembled where they were clasped tightly in front of my starched apron. I pressed my thumbs into my palms, letting the brief bite of my fingernails ground me in the present moment. Beneath the layers of cheap cotton and polyester, deep within the warmth of my own body, a tiny, barely perceptible flutter rippled through my lower abdomen. The baby. Julian's baby. The very thing that had transformed me from an invisible servant into an existential threat to the Vance empire. I don't understand. Mrs. Vance, I lied, my voice tight. I kept my chin lowered, assuming the posture of submission I had been trained to maintain since the day I was hired. I knew exactly what she was doing. The subtext of the conversation had been clear the moment her loyal butler, Thomas, had intercepted me in the kitchen corridor and escorted me to the West Wing, a part of the house the staff only entered to clean when it was entirely empty. Eleanor finally raised her eyes. They were the color of glacial ice, entirely devoid of warmth. She studied my face, her gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to my waistline. The apron hid the slight rounding of my stomach, but she knew. Of course she knew. In this house, the walls had ears, the paintings had eyes, and Eleanor Vance was the spider sitting at the center of the web, feeling every vibration. "You are a smart girl, Maya," she murmured, leaning back in her high-backed leather chair. The leather creaked, a sound like a tightening rope. "You've always been quiet. Efficient. It's why I allowed Thomas to keep you on staff despite your lack of formal experience. You blend into the background. You know your place." She paused, letting the silence stretch, tightening the invisible screws. But lately, it seems you've forgotten the fundamental rule of your employment. Which is?" The words slipped out before I could swallow them. It was a mistake. A momentary lapse in my defensive wall. Eleanor's lips twitched upward in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That you are temporary. The things in this house, the people in this house, belong to a world you can never inhabit. You are a tourist here. And your visa has expired. Look." She tapped a single, perfectly polished fingernail against the top of the envelope. Tap, 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 tap. The sound synchronized perfectly with the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Time was running out. My time. "There is $500,000 in cash in this envelope," she stated, her tone conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than purchasing my banishment. "It is entirely untraceable. There is also a secondary envelope beneath it containing a new passport, a driver's license, and a one-way ticket to a very quiet, very charming town in the Pacific Northwest. I am told the schools there are excellent." She knew about the baby. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The air in the study suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if a vacuum had been activated, sucking the oxygen from the room. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the sudden surge of nausea. It wasn't morning sickness this time. It was pure, unadulterated terror. $500,000. For a girl who had grown up bouncing between foster homes in New Jersey, scraping by on diner tips before landing this job, it was an astronomical sum. It was freedom. It was safety. But I knew the Vances. I knew how their money worked. It wasn't a gift, it was a gag order. It was a leash. If I took it, I would be agreeing to erase myself from existence. And if I refused, I haven't asked for anything, I managed to say, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I kept my eyes on the envelope. I do my job. I clean the rooms. I keep my head down. You did, Eleanor corrected softly. She uncrossed her legs, the silk of her trousers rustling loudly in the quiet room. Until you allowed my son to entertain himself with you. Until you allowed a temporary indulgence to become a permanent complication. The word hit the air like a stone dropped in a glass pond. Complication. That was what this child was to her. Not a grandchild. Not a life. A complication in the grand ledger of the Vance family business. A business that I knew, from hushed conversations overheard in dark hallways, involved far more than real estate acquisitions and hedge funds. Julian Vance was a respected CEO in the daylight, a man whose picture graced the covers of financial magazines. But in the shadows of this estate, men arrived in the dead of night with broken knuckles and blood on their expensive Italian shoes. Julian commanded an empire built on violence, a syndicate that had controlled the city's underbelly for generations. He was a monster to the world. But to me, a memory flashed behind my eyes, unbidden and sharp. The midnight kitchen. The scent of his expensive vetiver cologne mixing with the smell of the lemon cake I was stealing from the pantry. The way his massive hand had gently wrapped around my wrist. Not bruising, just holding. The dark, dangerous heat in his eyes when he pressed me against the cold refrigerator door, his voice a low, rough rasp in the dark. You don't look at me like they do, Maya. You just look at me. I blinked, dragging myself back to the sterile coldness of the study. Julian was currently in Manhattan, finalizing a merger that the news claimed would reshape the telecommunications industry. He wouldn't be back until tomorrow. Eleanor had chosen her moment with tactical precision. She was excising the tumor while the surgeon was out of the room. Julian is a powerful man, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a maternal, almost sympathetic tone that made my blood run ice cold. Powerful men have appetites, they have distractions. But eventually, they must marry appropriately. They must build alliances. A maid from Newark carrying a bastard child does not fit into the architecture of his future. In fact, it is actively detrimental to it. He doesn't know, I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Julian didn't know. I hadn't told him. Lie. Show. I had been terrified of what he would do, terrified of what he was capable of. A man who could order the destruction of a rival family over a misplaced shipment of goods was not a man you casually informed about an unplanned pregnancy. I had planned to run. I had been saving my meager wages for months, planning to slip away in the night before my uniform wouldn't button anymore. But Eleanor had beaten me to the punch. Of course he doesn't. Eleanor smiled, a terrifying, razor-thin expression. If he knew, he would feel obligated. He has an unfortunate streak of possessiveness regarding his toys. He would keep you. He would hide you away in some penthouse. A dirty little secret that his enemies would eventually discover and use against him. I am saving him from his own predictable weaknesses. And I am saving you. Maya. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk. The diamonds on her fingers caught the pale light, glittering like shattered glass. The roads in winter are treacherous, she whispered, her voice dropping an octave, glittering from cultured matriarch to the ruthless mob widow she truly was. The ice blackens. Brakes fail. Tragic accidents happen to careless girls who wander too far from where they belong. 2. The world is a very dangerous place for a young, expectant mother with no family and no protection. My breath hitched. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. Cold and metallic. Right beside the envelope. Take the money and disappear, or end up as a brief, tragic headline in a local paper. The Vance family cleaned up their messes, they always had. I looked at the envelope. My hand hovered over it. The paper seemed to vibrate with a magnetic pull. I thought of the Pacific Northwest. I thought of pine trees and rain, far away from the blood and the shadows of New York. I could take it. I could run. I could give this child a life entirely free from the violence that coursed through its father's veins. My fingers brushed the edge of the manila paper. It felt dry. Rough. Eleanor sat back. Satisfied. She had won. She always won. A wise choice, she murmured, reaching for her silver tea bell. But before her fingers could graze the metal, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a change in the barometric pressure, a sudden, heavy suffocation that pressed against the eardrums. The air grew dense, charged with an electric hostility that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then came the sound. The heavy, solid oak doors of the study didn't just open. They were shoved apart with a force that made the brass hinges scream. I flinched, snatching my hand back from the envelope as if it had caught fire, and spun around. Julian stood in the doorway. He was supposed to be in Manhattan. He was supposed to be surrounded by lawyers and board members. Instead, he was here. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, but the tie was ripped loose, hanging crookedly around his neck. His top button was undone, and his dark hair, usually impeccably styled, was slightly windblown. Raindrops darkened the shoulders of his suit jacket. He had driven himself. Fast. But it was his face that paralyzed me. I had seen Julian angry. I had seen him coldly dress down executives and quietly threaten rivals with a dead-eyed calm that was terrifying to behold. But this was different. This was not the calculated wrath of a mob boss. This was raw, unadulterated, primal violence. The muscles in his jaw were locked so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. His dark eyes bypassed me entirely, locking onto his mother with a predatory intensity that seemed to suck all the light from the room. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched, taut and vibrating, a guitar string pulled entirely too far. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was caught in the no man's land, between two apex predators. Eleanor was the first to recover. Her spine stiffened, the momentary shock quickly masked by years of practiced aristocratic discipline. She did not stand up. She remained seated, projecting an aura of unbothered control, though I noticed the slight, betraying tremor in the fingers she rested on the desk. "Julian," she said, her voice perfectly level, attempting to assert the dominance of a mother over her child. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow evening. The Sterling merger. I wasn't aware we were balancing the accounts today, Mother." Julian cut her off. His voice was devastatingly quiet. It was the low rumble of an earthquake before the ground splits open. He stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him with a resonant boom that made me jolt. He moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of a large cat, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor until he stepped onto the Persian rug. He didn't look at me. Not yet. It was as if acknowledging my presence would shatter the fragile restraint holding him back. He walked slowly toward the desk, his eyes fixed dead on Eleanor. Every step he took seemed to compress the air in the room further. I backed away, pressing myself against the towering bookshelves, my hands instinctively crossing over my stomach, an ancient, primitive urge to shield the life inside me from the impending collision. Julian reached the desk. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fists. He simply looked down at the thick manila envelope sitting exactly where I had left it. He stared at it for a long, agonizing moment. Then, he slowly reached out. He picked up the envelope. He tested its weight in his hand. The silence was agonizing. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. "$500,000? Julian asked. His voice still that low, raspy whisper. He tilted his head, looking at Eleanor with a terrifying emptiness in his eyes. "Is that the going rate for Vance blood these days? Inflation is a bitch, isn't it?" The thick manila paper tore with a sound like a bone snapping. Julian didn't use sudden, jerky movements. He ripped the envelope slowly, deliberately, straight down the middle. The pristine stacks of $100 bills inside resisted for a fraction of a second before giving way, tearing in half along with the heavy casing. The sharp, bitter scent of ink and linen paper flooded the space between them. He let the ruined halves fall from his hands. They fluttered to the Persian rug, scattering across the intricate woven patterns like dead leaves. Eleanor's jaw tightened. It was a microscopic shift, a fleeting clench of the masseter muscle beneath her powdered skin, but in the suffocating stillness of the study, it was as loud as a gunshot. She lowered her hands from the desk, hiding them in the folds of her silk trousers. "That was unnecessary, Julian," she stated, her voice dropping a fraction in pitch, losing the artificial maternal warmth. The Connecticut drawl was replaced by the flat, metallic cadence of the boardroom. And highly irrational. "You are bleeding capital over a situation that was already managed." "You're Chand." "Managed." Julian repeated the word, rolling it around in his mouth as if tasting a bad vintage. He took a slow step around the edge of the mahogany desk, invading her personal space. The scent of rain and wet asphalt clinging to his coat completely overpowered the citrus furniture polish. "Is that what we call it now? Managing?" He leaned down, placing both of his large hands flat on the polished wood, mirroring the posture she had held moments before, but imposing a massive, predatory shadow over her. His knuckles bleached stark white against the dark wood. "You authorized a withdrawal from the Cayman account without my signature," he said, the raspy whisper growing denser, vibrating with a lethal frequency. "You mobilized Thomas to clear the West Wing. You pulled a rat off the street to forge federal documents." He tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You attempted to exile what is mine." "In my house." "She is a maid, Julian," Eleanor fired back, the pristine facade cracking just enough to let a sliver of venom hiss through. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and entirely devoid of humanity. "She is a temporary fixture who forgot her place. She is carrying a vulnerability. A liability. Our enemies are currently circling the docks in Brooklyn. The feds are auditing the shell companies in Delaware. And you are playing house with the hired help. I was excising a cancer before it could metastasize." The air in my lungs turned to lead. The baby fluttered again, a tiny, frantic thrum against my ribs, reacting to the sudden spike of adrenaline flooding my bloodstream. Liability. Cancer. I pressed my spine harder against the bookshelf, wishing the leather-bound encyclopedias would swallow me whole. I kept my chin tucked, my gaze fixed on the torn $100 bills on the rug. Julian didn't look at me. He kept his focus entirely on Eleanor. "The docks are secure," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any fluctuation. "The auditors in Delaware will find exactly what we want them to find. And as for what happens in this house," he leaned closer, until his face was inches from hers. "You are retired, Mother. The gavel was passed 5 years ago. You sit at the head of the table at Thanksgiving, but you do not sit at the head of the commission. You do not touch my accounts. And you do not touch my property." The word hit me with the physical force of a blow to the stomach. Property. It wasn't a defense of a lover. It wasn't the heroic rescue of a pregnant woman. It was a declaration of ownership. A territorial dispute between two wolves over a piece of meat. The illusion of safety, the brief spark of hope that had flared in my chest when he broke through those doors, instantly turned to ash. I hadn't been saved. I had just been reclassified on the Vance family inventory sheet. Eleanor stared back at him, her glacial eyes unblinking. The standoff stretched. The silence heavy and suffocating. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a steady, rhythmic judgment. Finally, Eleanor slowly leaned back in her chair, creating distance. She reached for the silver letter opener on her desk, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of her leather blotter. "You are letting sentiment cloud your strategy," she murmured, picking up her reading glasses and slipping them onto her face, a clear signal that the negotiation was over. "A dangerous precedent. When your father made a similar mistake in '89 with that dancer from Queens, it cost us 3 warehouses and a cousin. Keep your pet if you must. But do not expect me to clean the blood off the carpets when this inevitably unravels." Julian straightened up. The violent tension radiating from his frame didn't dissipate. It merely coiled tighter, drawing inward. He turned his back on her, a profound gesture of disrespect in their world, and finally looked at me. His dark eyes swept over my rigid posture, taking in the starched maid's uniform, the tightly clasped hands over my stomach, the way my breathing was shallow and erratic. His gaze lingered on my midsection for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. There was no warmth in his expression, no soft, paternal realization. It was the calculating look of a man assessing a vault. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. "Walk," he commanded. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and headed for the shattered double doors. I pushed myself off the bookshelf, my knees trembling so violently they knocked against each other. I stumbled slightly on the edge of the Persian rug, my cheap orthopedic shoes catching on the fringe. Julian stopped, turning his head just enough to watch me regain my footing. He waited until I was moving behind him, falling into line like a well-trained dog. We left the study, the heavy oak doors remaining wide open behind us, a gaping wound in the pristine silence of the West Wing. We stepped into the main corridor. The temperature immediately dropped, the cold draft from the massive marble foyer sweeping down the hallway. Thomas was standing 20 feet away, positioned near the grand staircase. The butler was a fixture of the Vance estate, a tall, gaunt man with thinning gray hair and eyes that always seemed to be looking at a point just over your shoulder. I had spent the last 2 years fetching his dry cleaning and polishing his silver serving trays. I knew his routines, his precise, measured way of walking. But as Julian and I approached, Thomas's posture was different. His feet were planted slightly wider apart. His right hand rested casually, just an inch too high, near the lapel of his tailored morning coat. It was a stance I had seen on the men who guarded the perimeter of the estate at night. Julian didn't slow down. As we passed Thomas, Julian didn't even turn his head. "If she crosses the threshold of this wing again," Julian said to the empty air in front of him, his voice echoing sharply off the marble walls, "I will have you stripped, Thomas. And I will start with your hands." Thomas's face remained a masterclass in stoicism, but I caught the micro-expression. A rapid, double blink. A swallow that made his Adam's apple bob sharply against his stiff white collar. His right hand slowly lowered from his lapel, resting flat against his thigh. "Understood, Mr. Vance." Thomas replied, his voice perfectly modulated, betraying none of the absolute terror that was radiating from his pores. I kept my head down, forcing my legs to keep pace with Julian's long strides. We bypassed the servant stairs entirely. Julian led me up the grand central staircase, a sweeping curve of imported Italian marble that I had spent countless hours scrubbing on my hands and knees with a toothbrush. The plush crimson carpet running down the center swallowed the sound of his leather shoes, making our ascent feel like a silent film. We reached the 3rd floor. This was Julian's private sanctuary. The entire floor was secured by a biometric lock and steel-reinforced doors designed to look like carved mahogany. No staff was allowed up here without explicit permission, which was usually only granted to the head housekeeper once a week under the watchful eye of a security detail. Julian pressed his thumb to the scanner hidden beneath a decorative sconce. The heavy door clicked, a solid, heavy sound of tumblers falling into place, and swung open on silent hinges. He stepped inside and waited for me to cross the threshold. The moment my shoes touched the dark hardwood of his private foyer, he pushed the door shut behind me. The heavy thud of the locks engaging severed the outside world completely. The ambient noise of the massive house, the distant hum of the HVAC system, the faint rattle of pipes vanished. The silence in this space was absolute, suffocating, airless. "Take that off," Julian said. I flinched, my hands instinctively flying to the collar of my uniform. I backed up until my shoulders hit the cold steel of the reinforced door. My heart hammered against my sternum, a frantic, trapped rhythm. Julian let out a slow, measured breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the confrontation wearing off, leaving behind a jagged, dangerous exhaustion. He shrugged off his wetsuit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a silk-upholstered bench. "The uniform, Maya," he clarified, his voice lower, the rough edges smoothed out but still carrying that underlying vibration of command. "Take off the apron. The collar. You don't wear that in here." My fingers fumbled with the stiff white strings of the apron at my waist. The knot was tight, pulled taut by my own nervous hands hours ago. I picked at the fabric, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't get a grip. Julian watched me struggle for a moment. Then, he closed the distance between us. I braced myself, squeezing my eyes shut, expecting a reprimand. expecting violence. Instead, I felt the heavy, calloused warmth of his hands brush mine away. His fingers, smelling faintly of gunpowder, expensive leather, and rain, deftly untied the knot at the small of my back. He pulled the apron free, dropping it onto the floor. Then, his hands moved to the back of my neck. I held my breath, my chest rising and falling rapidly. He unhooked the stiff white collar, his thumbs grazing the sensitive skin at the base of my skull. The touch sent a violent shiver down my spine. He stepped back, tossing the collar onto the pile with the apron. I stood before him in the plain, shapeless black cotton dress that served as the base of the uniform. Without the rigid structure of the apron, the slight, undeniable curve of my lower stomach was visible. Julian's eyes dropped to it. The silence stretched again. The air in the room felt thick, viscous. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so I wouldn't flinch again. He placed his large right hand flat against the center of my stomach. The heat radiating from his palm penetrated the cheap cotton, sinking deep into my skin. It wasn't a caress. It was a physical claim. A heavy, unyielding brand. 4 months, he stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, I breathed, the word barely making it past my lips. You were going to run. But, you. I was going to leave, I corrected softly, staring at the center of his chest, refusing to meet his eyes. I had money saved. I wasn't going to take her money. His hand contracted slightly against my stomach, his fingers pressing into the soft flesh. Her money, your money, it makes no difference. You were going to steal what belongs to me. The certainty in his voice made my stomach drop. Steal. In Julian Vance's world, theft was punished by death. He dropped his hand, and turned away, walking into the sprawling expanse of his living area. Go to the bathroom. Shower. There are clean clothes in the left closet that will fit you. I need to make a call. Call. He didn't wait for me to move. He walked over to a massive, custom-built desk in the corner of the room, picking up a secure satellite phone. I remained frozen by the door for a long minute, watching him dial. His posture was rigid again, the CEO returning to the helm, the mob boss orchestrating a war. He spoke in rapid, low Russian, a language I knew he only used when coordinating with the Bratva factions operating out of Brighton Beach. I pushed myself away from the door and moved toward the hallway leading to the master suite. The carpets up here were absurdly thick, muffling my footsteps entirely. I felt like a ghost haunting a museum. The master bathroom was larger than the apartment I had grown up in. Floor-to-ceiling marble, a massive soaking tub, and a glass-enclosed shower that looked out over the darkened estate through smart glass windows that were currently opaque. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me, leaning against it, finally allowing my lungs to take in a deep, shuddering breath. I turned on the shower, letting the water run scalding hot, filling the massive room with thick, white steam. I stripped off the cheap black dress and the practical cotton underwear, kicking the heavy orthopedic shoes into the corner. I stepped into the water, letting the heat beat down on my tense shoulders. I closed my eyes, the events of the last hour playing on a horrific, repeating loop behind my eyelids. The envelope. Eleanor's glacial eyes. The sound of Julian ripping the money. The weight of his hand on my stomach. I pressed my palms against the wet tiles, bowing my head. I had traded one executioner for another. Eleanor wanted me dead to protect the family legacy. Julian wanted me alive to secure it. I was a vessel. A walking incubator for the next generation of the Vance syndicate. Once the baby was born, what use would he have for me? I was a liability, just as Eleanor had said. A soft spot. A weakness. The water washed away the physical sweat of the day, but it couldn't wash away the deep, bone-chilling cold that had settled into my marrow. After 20 minutes, the water began to lose its scalding edge. I turned it off and wrapped myself in a massive, obscenely soft Egyptian cotton towel. I dried my hair roughly, avoiding the mirror spanning the length of the double manatee. I didn't want to see my own face. I didn't want to see the hollow fear in my eyes. I stepped out of the bathroom into the adjoining walk-in closet. Julian had said the left side. I walked past rows of bespoke Italian suits, silk ties arranged by color, and custom-made leather shoes. The scent of his vetiver cologne was overpowering here, mingling with cedar wood and expensive leather. The left side of the closet was different. It didn't hold men's clothing. I froze. The racks on the left side were filled with women's clothing. Not generic, unworn guest robes. Real clothing. Cashmere sweaters in neutral tones, silk blouses, tailored slacks, and a row of heavy winter coats. They were all pristine, impeccably organized. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the sleeve of a charcoal cashmere sweater. It was soft, lighter than air. I checked the tag. The brand was something European, something I couldn't pronounce. I checked the size. It was my size. Exactly my size. I moved down the line, checking a pair of slacks. My size. My size. My size. I opened a drawer built into the cedar island in the center of the closet. It was filled with silk undergarments. All my size. In the corner, a row of shoes. Ranging from practical flats to winter boots. All size 7. My size. My breathing grew shallow again. The air in the closet felt instantly oppressive, filled with invisible dust that choked my lungs. This wasn't a guest closet. These weren't clothes he had hastily ordered an hour ago. This collection took time to assemble. It took careful measurement, precise observation. He hadn't found out about the baby today. He hadn't intercepted Eleanor out of sudden, shocking realization. I backed away from the racks, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. I bumped into the cedar island, spinning around. On top of the island sat a sleek, locked leather briefcase. But next to it, resting innocently on the polished wood, was a thick, leather-bound tablet folder. It was slightly ajar. I knew I shouldn't touch it. In this house, curiosity was a fatal disease. But the adrenaline was still humming in my veins. Mixing with a sudden, sharp clarity, I reached out and flipped the leather cover open. It was a physical file, not a digital one. The Vances didn't trust digital records for the things that truly mattered. The top page was a medical summary. The logo in the corner belonged to the private clinic where I had taken my mandatory staff physical 5 months ago. The physical that Eleanor required for all new hires. My eyes scanned the dense medical jargon, locking onto a highlighted section near the bottom. Patient, Maya Evans. Blood type, O negative. HCG levels. Elevated. Estimated gestational age. 4 weeks. The date on the document was almost 4 months ago. He knew. He had known since the very beginning. Since the first week I had missed my period, before I had even taken the cheap drugstore test in the staff bathroom. My hands began to shake so violently the heavy paper rattled against the leather cover. I flipped to the next page. It was a background check. But it wasn't the standard employment check. It was a deep dive. My birth certificate. The name of the hospital in New Jersey. The names of my biological parents' names I hadn't seen on paper in 15 years. The arrest records of my father. The overdose report of my mother. And then, the foster care records. Every home I had been placed in. Every school I had attended. Every minimum wage job I had held. It was all there, documented, categorized, analyzed. But there was something else. A third page. A financial ledger. It showed a series of wire transfers from a shell corporation in Delaware, the same shell companies Eleanor had mentioned. The transfers were dated 10 years ago. They were payments made to the specific group home in Newark, where I had spent my teenage years. The memo lines were vague: charitable donation. Facility maintenance. I flipped the page frantically. Another ledger. Payments memo to the diner manager who had fired me right before I saw the recruitment ad for the Vance estate. My lungs seized. The room began to tilt. I hadn't found this job by accident. I hadn't applied and gotten lucky. I had been herded. I had been systematically isolated, financially starved, and funneled directly to the gates of the Vance estate. Why? Why go through all this trouble for a maid? My eyes darted back to the first page. The medical report. Blood type, O negative. A memory surfaced. Sharp. And cruel. A late-night conversation overheard in the library between Julian and his family doctor. Julian had been injured, a deep laceration on his arm. The doctor had been agitated. You need to be careful, Julian. Your blood type is a rare mutation. We don't have a donor match in the city. If you lose too much, I can't synthesize a replacement. O negative. The universal donor. But it wasn't just about my blood. I looked at the genetic markers listed below my blood type. A series of complex alphanumeric codes indicating absence of hereditary diseases, specific bone marrow compatibilities, genetic purity. I wasn't just a maid. I wasn't an accidental lover. I was livestock. They had vetted me. They had purchased my path, ensuring I arrived at their door desperate, alone, with no family to ask questions. They had put me in close proximity to him. The baby wasn't an accident, it was a harvest. A genetically engineered heir. Carefully bred for the throne, carrying the exact right combination of blood and bone to survive in this violent world. Eleanor hadn't been trying to exile me because I was a liability. She had been trying to exile me because she didn't want Julian to have an heir. An heir meant Julian's power would solidify, cutting her out entirely. She wasn't protecting the family, she was protecting her own seat at the table. And Julian had known all along. He had watched me panic. He had watched me hide my stomach. He had let me live in terror, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap, using his mother's move to justify locking me in this vault. Find everything you were looking for? BM. The voice came from the doorway of the closet. I spun around, dropping the folder. It hit the cedar island with a heavy thud, sliding off and crashing to the floor, paper spilling across the plush carpet. Julian stood leaning against the doorframe. He had taken off his tie and unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his shirt. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid in his right hand. The ice clinked softly as he swirled it. His face was completely unreadable. The violent rage from the study was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying calm. He didn't look at the papers on the floor. He kept his dark eyes fixed on my face, watching the color drain from my cheeks, watching the horrifying realization map itself across my features. He took a sip of his drink, the ice hitting his teeth with a sharp clack. You should put something on. He noted quietly, his gaze dropping to the towel I was clutching to my chest like a shield. The climate control up here is unpredictable. The climate control up here is unpredictable. The ice in his glass shifted, a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed in the cavernous silence of the closet. I didn't move. My fingers were locked in a death grip around the thick Egyptian cotton of the towel, the knuckles aching with the strain. The air between us was entirely stagnant, heavy with the sharp scent of his cologne and the dry, dusty smell of the spilled medical records on the floor. He didn't rush. Julian Vance never rushed. He pushed off the doorframe with a slow, deliberate shift of his weight, the muscles of his chest moving fluidly beneath the unbuttoned silk shirt. He took a step into the closet. His leather shoe came down directly on the first page of my file, the background check. The heavy paper crumpled beneath his sole, a dry, protesting sound that made the back of my throat close up. He didn't look down. He kept his gaze pinned to my face, tracing the frantic, erratic pulse beating against my collarbone. You are shivering, he observed. The raspy baritone of his voice was devoid of malice, devoid of triumph. It was a simple recitation of a fact, delivered with the terrifying detachment of a scientist observing a specimen in a glass jar. Don't, I choked out. The word tasted metallic, scraped raw against my vocal cords. I backed up, my bare heels hitting the smooth wood of the cedar island. There was nowhere left to go. He stopped a mere 2 feet away. Close enough that the heat radiating from his large frame began to combat the chill of the air conditioning. He lifted the glass, the amber liquid catching the recessed lighting, and took a slow sip. His throat worked as he swallowed. Don't what, Maya? He murmured, lowering the glass. Don't provide for you? Don't ensure that the mother of my bloodline has adequate winter clothing? He gestured vaguely with his free hand toward the racks of pristine cashmere and silk. You prefer the polyester? You prefer the orthopedic shoes and the minimum wage? You prefer the constant, gnawing arithmetic of survival? I stared at the hollow of his throat, refusing to look into his eyes. You bought me, I whispered, the reality of it settling into my bones like lead. Before I even knew this place existed. You bought my debts. You bought the diner manager. You paved the road. I removed obstacles, Julian corrected smoothly. He shifted his weight, his shoe grinding the paper beneath it slightly. You were drifting. A statistical anomaly with a perfect genetic profile, wasting away in diners that smelled of stale grease and despair. I simply redirected the current. I am not a project. My voice trembled, breaking on the final syllable. My hands instinctively shifted beneath the towel, pressing against my lower abdomen, shielding the tiny, unseen flutter. Julian's eyes tracked the movement. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The cold, calculating CEO vanished, replaced by something ancient, feral, and utterly possessive. The air pressure in the closet seemed to drop, sucking the oxygen from my lungs. "No," he agreed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating frequency. "You are an architecture. You are the foundation upon which the next century of this family will be built." He reached out, his movements so slow they felt hypnotic. I flinched, turning my head away, but his large hand simply cupped the side of my face. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, rough calluses scraping against my damp skin. "Eleanor operates on fear. She looks at you and sees a vulnerability. A crack in the armor. She is a relic of a bygone era, fighting wars with rusted swords." He stepped closer, invading my space entirely. The scent of him smoke, rain, vetiver, and dark liquor was suffocating. "I look at you," he breathed, his thumb pausing just below my ear, pressing slightly against the rapid thrum of my carotid artery, "and I see absolute security. I see a vault that no federal auditor can breach. I see the continuation." I pulled my face away from his touch. The physical contact felt like a brand, searing into my skin. "And when the baby is born?" I asked, my voice a hollow reed. "What happens to the vault when it's empty?" The silence stretched. Julian didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, a long, calculating stare that seemed to strip away the towel, the skin, the muscle, right down to the marrow. He took another sip of his drink, the ice clinking sharply. "Put on the charcoal sweater and the black slacks," he ordered, his tone shifting back to the flat, metallic cadence of command. He turned on his heel, stepping over the scattered files as if they were nothing but dead leaves. "Come out to the sitting room when you are decent. We are going to have dinner. Reet." He walked out of the closet, the heavy footsteps fading into the plush carpet of the master suite. I collapsed against the cedar island, my knees buckling. I slid down the smooth wood, hitting the floor amidst the scattered papers of my own engineered history. My breath came in short, jagged gasps. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in the damp towel. The baby kicked, a distinct, sharp pressure against my uterine wall. It was no longer a vague flutter. It was a life. A life that had already been catalogued, insured, and weaponized before it had even drawn its first breath. It took me 10 minutes to force my limbs to function. My skin was numb as I pulled on the charcoal cashmere sweater. It was obscenely soft, floating over my skin like a ghost. The black slacks fit perfectly, sitting comfortably below the slight swell of my stomach. Every seam, every stitch felt like a chain pulling tight around my throat. I walked out of the closet. The master suite was dimly lit, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the winter night. I moved down the hallway toward the private sitting area. Julian was sitting in a low-slung leather armchair by the fireplace. The fire was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows across his face. A small, circular dining table had been set near the windows. 2 plates under silver cloches, crystal water goblets, a bottle of sparkling water resting in an ice bucket. He had planned this, too. He had known exactly how the confrontation with Eleanor would end. He had already ordered the catering. He gestured to the empty chair across the table. "Sit." I walked over, my movement stiff, robotic. I pulled out the chair and sat on the edge of the velvet cushion. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Julian reached over, lifting the silver cloche from my plate. Searing hot filet mignon, perfectly roasted asparagus, and truffle mash. The smell, rich and intoxicating, hit my stomach like a physical blow. The nausea I had kept at bay all afternoon surged upward. I swallowed hard, pressing my lips together. "You need to eat," Julian said, lifting his own cloche. He picked up his knife and fork, his movements precise, elegant. "Your iron levels were marginal on the last draw." He was monitoring my blood work. Of course he was. The clinic in the city where I went for my employee health checks was entirely owned by a Vance subsidiary. "I'm not hungry," I said, staring at the pristine white tablecloth. Julian paused, his knife resting against the charred edge of his steak. He didn't look up. That wasn't a suggestion. Maya. The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the fireplace. I picked up my fork, my hand trembling so badly the silver rattled against the porcelain plate. I managed to cut a small piece of asparagus, forcing it into my mouth. It tasted like ash. I chewed mechanically, my throat tightening around the dry mass until I finally managed to swallow it. Julian watched me take the bite. Satisfied, he began to eat his own meal in silence. The quiet was agonizing. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a shared dinner. It was the tense, vibrating silence of a hostage situation. I watched the firelight play across the sharp angles of his jaw. And he ate with the same methodical, ruthless efficiency with which he dismantled his enemies. "Did you really think she would let me leave?" I asked, the question slipping out before my survival instincts could stop it. Julian didn't miss a beat. He sliced a piece of steak, his eyes fixed on the plate. Eleanor is a pragmatist. She calculated that a dead maid is a complication. But a missing maid with $500,000 is a closed file. If you had taken the envelope, Thomas would have driven you to the private airfield. You would have boarded a Cessna. He finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto mine over the flickering candlelight. The Cessna would have experienced a catastrophic hydraulic failure somewhere over the Appalachian Mountains. My fork slipped from my fingers, clattering loudly against the plate. The sound echoed in the quiet room. My breath hitched. "She wouldn't," I whispered. $500,000. "The is cheap," Julian interrupted, his voice brutally flat. "It is a rounding error in our daily operational costs. The money was a prop. A psychological test to ensure you got into the car willingly, without causing a scene in the West Wing." He leaned back, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "You are naive, Maya. You still believe the world operates on principles of fairness. You still believe people tell the truth. You don't." "I never lie," he stated softly. "I simply curate the information you have access to. It is for your own protection." "Protection?" I let out a dry, humorless sound that scraped against my teeth. "You locked me in a cage. You locked me in a cage." "I placed you in a vault," he corrected, his jaw tightening slightly. "There is a significant difference." Before I could respond, the atmosphere in the room shattered. It wasn't a noise, it was the complete cessation of noise. The low, omnipresent hum of the central HVAC system instantly cut out. The flickering amber glow of the fireplace was suddenly the only light source in the room as the heavy crystal chandeliers above us went dead. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Across from me, I heard the sharp, instantaneous scrape of a chair pushing back violently against the hardwood floor. A split second later, a low, vibrating hum resonated through the floorboards, the massive diesel backup generators kicking in beneath the estate. But the grand chandeliers didn't turn back on. Instead, recessed tactical lights running along the baseboards flared to life, casting an eerie, blood-red glow across the floor. The heavy, metallic grind of steel shutters deploying echoed from the massive windows behind me. The smart glass instantly turned opaque, sealing us into a windowless box. The house was in full lockdown protocol. Julian was already moving. The red floor lights illuminated his legs as he crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He reached a solid wood panel near the fireplace, his hand sliding over a hidden biometric scanner. The panel popped open with a quiet hiss. When he turned back, the red light glinted off the matte black steel of a suppressed semi-automatic handgun. He racked the slide. The metallic clack-clack was the loudest sound I had ever heard. "What's happening?" I breathed, my voice barely a squeak. I pushed away from the table, my legs refusing to support my weight properly. I stumbled, catching myself on the back of the velvet chair. Julian didn't look at me. He was staring at his secure satellite phone, the screen illuminating his face in a harsh, blue light. His features were carved from granite. The pulse at the base of his throat was beating a rapid, violent rhythm. "Eleanor," he said, the word dripping with pure, distilled venom. She called the police?" I asked, my mind struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. Julian let out a dark, terrifying sound that was half laugh, half growl. He slipped the phone into his pocket and raised the gun, his eyes scanning the reinforced door of the suite. "The police do not trigger a Class 1 siege protocol. The police knock." He turned his head. his dark eyes locking onto mine. The predator was fully awake now. She didn't retreat, Maya. She realized I intercepted the package. She escalated. Ed. Escalated to what? I backed away, my spine hitting the cold wall near the hallway. A change in management, Julian stated coldly. A heavy, muffled thud reverberated through the floorboards, originating from somewhere deep within the lower levels of the house. It wasn't thunder. It was an explosive charge. My hands flew to my mouth, swallowing a scream. The baby kicked violently, reacting to the massive spike of adrenaline flooding my system. She hired a strike team, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he moved toward me. The Bratva faction out of Queens. She promised them the shipping routes if they removed the current obstacle sitting on the throne. He reached me in seconds. His large, free hand grabbed my upper arm. His grip was bruising, unyielding. He didn't pull me toward the door. He pulled me deeper into the master suite, toward the expansive walk-in closet. Julian. Wait. I stumbled over my own feet, dragging against his hold. Shut up and walk, he hissed, his eyes darting to the shadows. The steel doors will hold for exactly 4 minutes against thermite. Thomas gave them the override codes for the elevator shafts. Uni.T. Thomas.T. He dragged me past the racks of cashmere and silk, past the cedar island where the remnants of my manufactured life still lay scattered on the floor. He pushed me toward the back wall of the closet, a solid slab of mirrored glass. He slammed his palm against a specific section of the mirror. A biometric scanner pulsed green. The heavy glass didn't swing open, it recessed backward and slid seamlessly into the wall, revealing a dark, narrow corridor lit only by the same eerie red emergency lights. Get in, he shoved me roughly into the dark space. I stumbled, my hands hitting cold, raw concrete. The smell of stale, filtered air and antiseptic hit my nostrils. I spun around. Julian stepped into the corridor behind me. He pressed a button on the inside wall. The heavy mirrored door slid shut with a pneumatic hiss, sealing perfectly. The muffled sounds of the massive estate vanished instantly. We were in a tomb. Move, Julian commanded, pressing the barrel of the gun against his leg, pointing down the narrow, red-lit hallway. I walked, my breathing echoing loudly in the confined space. The corridor sloped downward, spiraling into the very foundation of the estate. The temperature dropped significantly. My teeth began to chatter, a loud, uncontrollable sound. At the end of the hall, another reinforced steel door waited. It was a vault door, the kind used in federal banks, complete with a massive spinning wheel. Julian bypassed the wheel entirely, typing a 20-digit code into a keypad hidden beneath a steel flap. The heavy bolts disengaged with a series of loud, echoing clanks. He pushed the massive door open with his shoulder. He reached inside and hit a switch. A blinding array of harsh, fluorescent white lights flickered to life, stabbing into my dilated pupils. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, stepping over the thick steel threshold. When my vision finally adjusted, the breath was completely punched from my lungs. I expected a bunker. I expected concrete walls, rations, monitors displaying security feeds. I was standing in a state-of-the-art, fully sterile medical suite. The walls were clad in seamless white antibacterial paneling. In the center of the room sat a hydraulic delivery bed, the stirrups glinting menacingly under the harsh lights. To the left, a massive, glass-enclosed infant incubator hummed with quiet, electrical life. To the right, banks of complex monitoring equipment, fetal heart rate monitors, and an ultrasound machine. Shelves lining the far wall were stocked with surgical instruments sealed in plastic, IV bags, and vials of medication. It was a delivery room. Built deep underground. Built specifically for me. I couldn't finish the sentence. My brain simply refused to process the horrifying reality of the room. The immaculate preparation. Back. And. Pros. Back. 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 Back, 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 back. The absolute certainty that I would never set foot in a public hospital. Julian stepped into the room, letting the massive vault door swing shut behind him. The lock engaged automatically, a heavy, final sound. He walked past me, placing the handgun onto a stainless steel surgical tray. It clattered loudly against the metal. He didn't look at the delivery bed. He walked straight to a computer terminal built into the wall. He rapidly typed in a sequence, bringing up a complex array of encrypted files. The perimeter is breached, he stated flatly, his eyes scanning lines of code. They are in the foyer. The security detail in the East Wing has been neutralized. I wasn't listening to him. I was slowly walking toward the center of the room. I touched the cold leather of the delivery bed. It was terrifyingly real. "You were going to lock me down here," I whispered, the words echoing off the sterile walls. "You were never going to let me leave the estate. Even to give birth. You built a slaughterhouse." Julian finally stopped typing. He slowly turned his head. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast deep, hollow shadows under his cheekbones. The adrenaline of the siege seemed to drain from him, leaving behind something utterly exhausted and hollow. "It is not a slaughterhouse, Maya," he said, his voice dropping to a low, ragged whisper. "It is a sanctuary. A sanctuary doesn't have locks on the outside of the door." I screamed, the terror finally breaking through the paralysis, erupting in a violent wave. I spun to face him, pointing a trembling finger at the incubator. "You are breeding a prisoner. You need an heir to secure your throne, and you don't care if I rot down here to give it to you." Julian stared at me. The silence in the underground vault was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the incubator and my own ragged, hyperventilating breaths. He slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. He looked at it for a long moment, his thumb rubbing over the smooth plastic casing. Then, he plugged it into the terminal. He hit a key. The large, flat-screen monitor mounted above the surgical equipment flickered to life. It didn't show security feeds. It didn't show the men with thermite burning through the doors upstairs. It showed a series of complex medical scans. Brain scans. I stopped screaming. The confusion overrode the panic for a fraction of a second. I looked at the monitor. Slices of a human brain, illuminated in stark black and white, but marred by spreading, jagged clusters of bright red and yellow tissue deep within the cerebral cortex. "I don't care about the throne," Julian said softly. He walked slowly toward me, stopping just a few feet away. The cold, impenetrable armor of the Mafia boss was entirely gone. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the medical suite, he looked pale. He looked sick. "Look at the date on the scans," he commanded quietly. I tore my eyes away from him and looked at the top corner of the screen. The date was 18 months ago. 6 months before I was hired at the estate. Huntington variant. Julian said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "A highly aggressive, genetically engineered neurodegenerative mutation, a parting gift from a rival family's biological warfare division 10 years ago. It laid dormant. It activated 18 months ago." My heart hammered against my ribs. The room began to spin, the white walls closing in. "Eleanor knows," Julian continued, his dark eyes fixed on my face, watching the horrifying puzzle pieces snap together in my mind. "She knows that within a year, my cognitive functions will degrade. My motor skills will fail. I will become a liability to the syndicate. That is why she organized the coup tonight. She is accelerating the timeline before I lose the ability to hold a gun." I looked from the scans to his face. The slight tremor in his hand when he reached for the glass of water. The way he sometimes pinched the bridge of his nose. Masking a migraine. It hadn't been exhaustion. It had been the decay. "The air," I breathed, taking a step back, hitting the cold metal of the delivery bed. Julian's eyes dropped to my stomach. The look was no longer possessive. It was desperate. It was the look of a drowning man staring at a life raft. "The mutation is dominant," Julian whispered. "But your genetic profile, your own negative blood, the specific absence of the HLA-B2/7 marker in your marrow, it is the only viable canvas capable of synthesizing a pure, uncorrupted stem cell line that matches my exact DNA sequence. He took another step, his shadow falling over me. I don't need an heir to rule the empire. Maya. His voice cracked. A devastating sound in the silence. I need the umbilical cord blood. I need the embryonic stem cells. He raised his hand, pointing to the shelves of surgical equipment, the bone saws, the extraction kits. I am not breeding a successor. He looked me dead in the eyes, the horrifying truth laying entirely bare. I am breeding my own cure. The word hung in the sterile, heavily filtered air of the underground medical suite. Cure. It didn't bounce off the white antibacterial panels, it sank into them. Absorbed by the chilling reality of the room. The hum of the infant incubator suddenly sounded deafening. A mechanical heartbeat waiting to be fed. I looked at the surgical tray resting on the stainless steel cart. The neatly arranged row of scalpels, the bone saws, the heavy, silver clamps designed to sever an umbilical cord. I looked at the heavy leather straps attached to the sides of the hydraulic delivery bed. Julian's chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven intervals. The pristine armor of the untouchable Vance patriarch had completely dissolved, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. The sweat gathering at his temples caught the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. His right hand, the hand that had held the gun, the hand that had ripped $500,000 in half with effortless violence, was now pressed flat against the edge of the computer terminal. It was shaking. It wasn't the subtle tremble of adrenaline. It was a violent, erratic vibration, a misfiring of neurons deep within his brainstem. The Huntington variant. The decay he had hidden so perfectly beneath bespoke suits and boardroom ruthlessness was fighting its way to the surface, accelerated by the catastrophic stress of the siege above us. Another muffled, subterranean boom vibrated through the concrete ceiling. Dust motes shook loose from the ventilation grates, dancing in the brilliant white light. They were blowing the elevator shaft. We had minutes, perhaps less. I kept my eyes on his trembling hand. The frantic, trapped bird rhythm of my own heart, a drumbeat that had deafened me for the last 4 hours, slowly began to decelerate. The cold sweat clinging to my spine dried. The tremor in my knees, the physical manifestation of the terrified, helpless maid from New Jersey, simply ceased. I drew in a long, deep breath. The air tasted of iodine and bleached cotton. It tasted clean. I unclasped my hands from over my stomach and let my arms fall loosely to my sides. I straightened my spine, vertebra by vertebra, until the cowering posture of the hired help was completely gone. The charcoal cashmere sweater settled smoothly over my shoulders. Julian's dark eyes darted from the monitor to my face. He registered the shift. The micro-expression of confusion flickered across his pale features, a tightening of the skin around his eyes. He expected me to be screaming, sobbing, clawing at the impenetrable vault door. He expected the livestock to panic in the slaughterhouse. The neurodegeneration, I said. My voice didn't echo. It didn't shake. It came out flat, smooth, carrying the dead weight of absolute zero. It targets the motor cortex first, then the executive function. How long have you been losing time, Julian? How many hours of the day do you spend staring at a wall, forgetting the names of your lieutenants? His jaw locked. He tried to push himself off the terminal, attempting to reclaim his physical dominance. But his left leg betrayed him. His knee buckled a fraction of an inch, forcing him to grip the metal edge tighter. You are in shock. He ground out, the raspy baritone fracturing. Sit down. When the perimeter is secured, Dr. Heiress will arrive through the secondary tunnel to administer a sedative. Dr. Heiress is currently bleeding out on the marble floor of his Upper East Side clinic, I replied, taking a slow, measured step away from the delivery bed. I ran my fingertips along the edge of the glass incubator. It was warm. A severe laceration to the carotid artery. A tragic, violent robbery gone wrong. It happened about 20 minutes after you ripped up Eleanor's envelope. The silence that followed was dense enough to stop a bullet. The hum of the HEPA filters faded into the background. Julian's pupils dilated until the dark brown iris was almost entirely swallowed by black. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound. What did you say? You can. What did you say? You can. 1. Bye. 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 I didn't repeat myself. I walked past the incubator, moving toward the surgical tray. I picked up the heavy, matte black handgun he had discarded. The metal was still warm from his grip. I didn't point it at him. I simply held it loosely in my right hand, feeling its weight, familiarizing myself with its balance. You never lie, Julian. You just curate the information. I tilted my head, studying the catastrophic unraveling of the man before me. The problem with curating information is that you eventually start believing your own archives. You built an empire on paranoia. You vetted every single atom that entered this estate. You bribed the foster care system. You bought the diner manager. You intercepted my medical records. You thought you were the architect. I raised the gun, casually checking the safety. You didn't find me, Julian. You didn't orchestrate my path to your front door. I looked up, locking my eyes onto his. I laid the breadcrumbs. I just waited for you to follow them. His trembling hand slipped from the terminal. He took a stumbling step backward, his back hitting the pristine white wall of the vault. He swallowed, the muscles in his throat convulsing. The blood tests. The HLA-B27 marker. I saw the raw data. Heiress pulled the marrow samples himself. Quiet. Heiress was an arrogant, underpaid gambling addict. I corrected softly, taking another step toward him. He owed a massive debt to a sports book operating out of Astoria. A debt held by people who were very, very interested in the sudden decline of Julian Vance's public appearances. It is remarkably easy to swap a marrow sample when the man holding the needle is terrified of losing his fingers. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a denial born of absolute terror. He looked at my stomach, the slight curve hidden beneath the expensive cashmere, then back to my face. The predator was entirely gone. Only the dying man remained. Who are you? He whispered. The whisper wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Eleanor told you, I said, stopping exactly 3 feet away from him, placing myself deliberately out of his arm's reach. Earlier today, in the study, she warned you about letting sentiment cloud your strategy. She reminded you of your father's mistake in 1989. The dancer from Queens. The name hit him like a physical blow. His head snapped back slightly against the wall. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, waxen mask. The Romanov faction. He breathed, the name of the rival syndicate tasting like poison on his tongue. My father wiped them out. Every safe house. Every warehouse. The entire bloodline. He missed the dancer, I whispered, the memories of a cold, mold-infested apartment in Brighton Beach flashing behind my eyes. The smell of cheap vodka and festering wounds. He missed the girl who was already 3 months pregnant when he ordered the hit on her husband. He missed my mother. I watched the realization detonate behind his eyes. The complete restructuring of his reality. The maid from New Jersey wasn't a statistical anomaly. She was a ghost from a war he thought his family had won 30 years ago. You engineered the Huntington variant, I continued, my voice taking on the rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of a requiem. Your father's scientists built it to decimate the Romanovs. But biological weapons are notoriously difficult to control, aren't they? The virus mutated. It jumped the track. By the time your father realized he had infected his own bloodline, he was already in a wheelchair, forgetting his own name. Eleanor locked him in the East Wing and told the world he had aggressive leukemia. She thought the virus died with him. Julian's chest heaved. He raised his hands, pressing the heels of his palms against his temples as if trying to physically hold his fracturing mind together. The tremors were moving up his arms now, a violent, chaotic shuddering. But you inherited it, I said, my gaze dropping to his shaking hands. A dormant time bomb in your DNA. And when it finally woke up 18 months ago, you panicked. You searched the globe for a cure. But you can't cure a weaponized genetic rot, Julian. You can only override it. You needed a perfectly blank genetic canvas. A pure Romanov bloodline, the very blood your family tried to eradicate. The baby. He choked on the word, his eyes wide, manic, staring at my waistline. The cord blood. It's a match. The scans confirmed it. It will overwrite the decay. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. I didn't name the satisfaction burning in my chest, I let it bleed into the corners of my eyes, letting him see the absolute, calculating darkness within me. You think I would let you put my child's blood into your veins? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, serrated whisper. I raised my free hand, resting it gently against my stomach. You think I came here to be your salvation? I let the silence stretch, savoring the absolute destruction of his hope. I am a Romanov, Julian. My blood doesn't overwrite the decay. I leaned in closer, and until I could smell the stale, sour sweat of his terror. It acts as a catalyst. He stopped breathing. The violent tremors froze for a microsecond. During the second trimester, I began taking a synthetic peptide compound. I explained smoothly, reciting the chemistry with clinical detachment. Completely undetectable in standard fetal monitoring. It passes the placental barrier. The stem cells developing in the umbilical cord right now aren't a cure. They are a highly concentrated, hyper-accelerated version of the very virus destroying your brain. I tapped the barrel of the gun lightly against his chest, right over his hammering heart. If Heiress had managed to perform the extraction, I whispered, if he had pumped that cord blood into your system, the Huntington variant wouldn't have killed you in a year. The peptide reaction would have liquefied your cerebral cortex in under 48 hours. You would have died screaming, locked in this very room, unable to control your own lungs. Julian stared at me, the utter totality of his defeat crushing him against the wall. The grand architect of the Vance Empire had built his own execution chamber, sourced his own poison, and locked himself inside with the executioner. A massive, bone-jarring explosion violently rocked the vault. The concrete floor pitched beneath my feet. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered wildly, buzzing with angry electricity before stabilizing. The heavy vault door groaned, a horrific, metal-on-metal scream, as the steel frame warped inward slightly. The siege had reached the basement. Julian's eyes snapped toward the massive steel door. A desperate, primal instinct for survival temporarily overrode the neurological collapse. He lunged forward, his shaking hands reaching for the gun in my hand. I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. I brought the heavy steel frame of the handgun up in a short, brutal arc, catching him dead on the cheekbone. The crack of bone was deafening in the sterile room. Julian staggered backward, crying out, his hands flying to his face. Blood instantly welled beneath his fingers, dripping down his pristine white silk shirt. A stark, violent contrast. He hit the edge of the delivery bed and collapsed against it, his legs finally giving out completely. He slid to the floor, gasping for air, the neurological tremors now amplified by the physical trauma. I stood over him, the gun steady in my hand, entirely unaffected by the violence. Eleanor, he gasped, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the white floor. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, desperate. She hired the Queen's faction. If they breach that door, they won't care who you are. They will kill us both. Thanks for way. They want the territory. I looked down at him. The mighty Julian Vance, begging for a unified front against a common enemy. The irony was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the room. I reached past him, my arm brushing his trembling shoulder, and keyed a command into the terminal. The medical scans vanished from the large monitor above us, replaced by a grid of security feeds from the outer corridors. The corridors were filled with thick, black smoke. The red emergency lights cut through the haze, illuminating heavily armed men moving with tactical precision. They were wearing dark tactical gear, gas masks obscuring their faces. They were methodically planting breaching charges on the hinges of the final vault door. Look closely, Julian, I commanded softly. He forced his head up, his bloody hands gripping the edge of the bed for support. He squinted at the monitor. The camera angle shifted slightly as one of the armed men stepped directly beneath the lens. He raised his arm to signal the team. As his sleeve rode up, the harsh red light caught the ink etched deeply into the skin of his forearm. A double-headed eagle. The crest of the Romanov syndicate. Julian's breath stopped entirely. The silence in the vault returned, heavier, darker than before. Eleanor didn't hire the Queen's faction, I said, my voice echoing in the clinical silence. Eleanor doesn't have the authority to mobilize an army, and she is far too terrified of you to try. She just wanted to bribe a maid. She wanted a quiet exit. I slowly lowered the gun, letting it hang by my side. There was no need for it anymore. I'd triggered the lockdown protocol from your satellite phone while you were making your drink, I revealed, the final, crushing piece of the puzzle sliding into place. I sent the signal. My men breached the perimeter. My men neutralized your security detail. Thomas didn't give up the override codes. They brought his severed thumb to the keypad. Julian stared at the monitor, watching the thermite spark brilliantly against the massive steel door of our tomb. The door he had locked. The door he had secured to trap me inside. You didn't trap a liability in your vault, Julian, I whispered, the sound of the burning thermite growing louder, a violent hiss bleeding through the thick concrete. I looked down at his broken, bleeding form, watching the last agonizing realization extinguish the light in his eyes. You locked yourself in a cage with the predator.